CSS Tutorial. Chapter 4. Borders, Margins, Padding and Height and Width. CSS Borders. The CSS border properties allow you to specify the style, width, and color of an element's border. This element has a groove border that is 15 pixel wide and green. The border style property specifies what kind of border to display. The following values are allowed. Dotted. Defines a dotted border. Dashed. Defines a dashed border. Solid. Defines a solid border. Double. Defines a double border. Groove. Defines a 3D grooved border. The effects depends on the border color value. Ridge. Defines a 3D ridged border. The effect depends on the border color value. Insert. Defines a 3D insert border. The effect depends on the border color value. Outset. Defines a 3D outset border. The effect depends on the border color value. None. Defines no border. Hidden. Defines a hidden border. The border style property can have from 1 to 4 values, for the top border, right border, bottom border, and the left border. Example of border styles. The border width property specifies the width of the 4 borders. The width can be set as a specific size, in pixel, point, centimeter, em, etc., or by using one of the 3 predefined values: thin, medium, or thick. The border width property can have from 1 to 4 values, for the top border, right border, bottom border, and the left border. Example of border width property. Note: the border width property does not work if it is used alone. Always specify the border style property to set the borders first. The border color property is used to set the color of the 4 borders. The color can be set by name. Specify a color name, like red. Hex. Specify a hex value, like #FF0000. RGB. Specify a RGB value, like RGB 255,0,0. Transparent. The border color property can have from 1 to 4 values, for the top border, right border, bottom border, and the left border. If border color is not set, it inherits the color of the element. Example of border color properties. Note: the border color property does not work if it is used alone. Use the border style property to set the borders first. From the examples you have seen that it is possible to specify a different border for each side. In CSS, there is also properties for specifying each of the borders, top, right, bottom, and left. Examples of border. Individual sides. The example above gives the same result as this. So, here is how it works. If the border style property has 4 values: border style, dotted solid double dashed, top border is dotted, right border is solid, bottom border is double, left border is dashed. If the border style property has 3 values: border style, dotted solid double, top border is dotted, right and left borders are solid, bottom border is double. If the border style property has 2 values: border style, dotted solid, top and bottom borders are dotted, right and left borders are solid. If the border style property has 1 value: border style, dotted, all 4 borders are dotted. The border style property is used in the example above. However, it also works with border width and border color. As you can see from the examples, there are many properties to consider when dealing with borders. To shorten the code, it is also possible to specify all the individual border properties in one property. The border property is a shorthand property for the following individual border properties: border width, border style, required, border color. Example of border shorthand property. All the top border properties in one declaration. This example demonstrates a shorthand property for setting all of the properties for the top border in one declaration. You can set the style of the bottom border. This example demonstrates how to set the style of the bottom border. Examples of setting the bottom border. Set the width of the left border. This example demonstrates how to set the width of the left border. You can set the color of the four borders. This example demonstrates how to set the color of the four borders. It can have from 1 to 4 colors. Note: the border color property does not work if it is used alone. Use the border style property to set the borders first. This example demonstrates how to set the color at the right border. CSS margins. The CSS margin properties are used to generate space around elements. The margin properties set the size of the white space outside the border. This element has a margin of 80 pixels. The CSS margin properties set the size of the white space outside the border. Note: the margins are completely transparent, and cannot have a background color. With CSS, you have full control over the margins. There are CSS properties for setting the margin for each side of an element: top, right, bottom, and left. CSS has properties for specifying the margin for each side of an element: margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. All the margin properties can have the following values. Auto. The browser calculates the margin length, specifies a margin in pixel, point, centimeter, etc. %, specifies a margin in % of the width of the containing element. Inherit, specifies that the margin should be inherited from the parent element. Note: it is also possible to use negative values for margins to overlap content. The following example sets different margins for all 4 sides of a P element. The following example lets the left margin be inherited from the parent element. To shorten the code, it is possible to specify all the margin properties in one property. The margin property is a shorthand property for the following individual margin properties: margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. Example of margin shorthand property. So, here is how it works. If the margin property has 4 values: margin 25 pixels, 50 pixels, 75 pixels, 100 pixels, top margin is 25 pixels, right margin is 50 pixels, bottom margin is 75 pixels, left margin is 100 pixels. If the margin property has 3 values: margins 25 pixels, 50 pixels, 75 pixels, top margin is 25 pixels, right and left margins are 50 pixels, bottom margin is 75 pixels. If the margin property has 2 values: margin 25 pixels, 50 pixels, top and bottom margins are 25 pixels, right and left margins are 50 pixels. If the margin property has 1 value: margin 25 pixels, all 4 margins are 25 pixels. You can set the margin property to auto to horizontally center the element within its container. The element will then take up the specified width, and the remaining space will be split equally between the left and right margins. Example of the use of auto values. CSS padding. The CSS padding properties are used to generate space around content. The padding properties set the size of the white space between the element content and the element border. This element has a padding of 50 pixels. The CSS padding properties define the white space between the element content and the element border. The padding clears an area around the content, inside the border, of an element. Note: the padding is affected by the background color of the element. With CSS, you have full control over the padding. There are CSS properties for setting the padding for each side of an element: top, right, bottom, and left. CSS has properties for specifying the padding for each side of an element: padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left. All the padding properties can have the following values. Length specifies a padding in pixel, point, centimeter, etc. Percent specifies a padding in percent of the width of the containing element. Inherit specifies that the padding should be inherited from the parent element. The following example sets different padding for all four sides of a P element. Example of individual padding properties. To shorten the code, it is possible to specify all the padding properties in one property. The padding property is a shorthand property for the following individual padding properties: padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left. Example of padding shorthand properties. So, here is how it works. If the padding property has four values: padding 25 pixels, 50 pixels, 75 pixels, 100 pixels. Top padding is 25 pixels, right padding is 50 pixels, bottom padding is 75 pixels, left padding is 100 pixels. If the padding property has three values: padding 25 pixels, 50 pixels, 75 pixels, top padding is 25 pixels, right and left paddings are 50 pixels, bottom padding is 75 pixels. If the padding property has two values: padding 25 pixels, 50 pixels, top and bottom paddings are 25 pixels, right and left paddings are 50 pixels. If the padding property has one value: padding 25 pixels, all four paddings are 25 pixels. This example demonstrates a shorthand property for setting all of the padding properties in one declaration, can have from 1 to 4 values. This example demonstrates how to set the left padding of a P element. This example demonstrates how to set the right padding of a P element. This example demonstrates how to set the top padding of a P element. This example demonstrates how to set the bottom padding of a P element. CSS height and width. The CSS dimension properties allow you to control the height and width of an element. This element has a width of 100%. The height and width properties are used to set the height and width of an element. Note, the height and width of this div element as a height of 100 pixels and a width of 500 pixels. The following example shows a div element with a height of 100 pixels and a width of 600 pixels. The max width property is used to set the maximum width of an element. The max width can be specified in length values, like pixel, centimeter, etc., or in percent of the containing block, or set to none. This is default, means that there is no maximum width. The problem with the div above occurs when the browser window is smaller than the width of the element, 500 pixels. The browser then adds a horizontal scroll bar to the page. Using max width instead, in this situation, will improve the browser's handling of small windows. Tip: drag the browser window to smaller than 500 pixel wide, to see the difference between the two diffs. Note: the value of the max width property overrides width. This is an example of setting max width of an element.